to do this. But you're lucky also because you listen to Eugenia Siapera, that we're happy to have here with us in this conference. Eugenia is actually comes from Thessaloniki, so she knows really well this city, better than us probably. But she's been working in Ireland since some years in the Dublin College University, and she has been leader in a research project which is called JOLT, which is one of the biggest H2020 projects financed by the European Union for research, PhD research on digital journalism. So she's a specialist on digital journalism, and today she will talk about journalism in a polarized world, what ethics and values for the information disorder. So she has loads of stuff to say, some videos to show. So, Eugenia, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Nikos, for the introduction. Hi, everybody. I hope your hangovers are better from yesterday. Okay, so I will talk about values and ethics for the information disorder. And to begin with, I'm sure that all of you have heard of the information disorder. I will talk a little bit more about the components of the information disorder, but for now and for most of us, this idea is that the idea behind the information disorder is that there's something wrong in the information ecosystem and that journalism is somehow involved in this. So information disorder, of course, comprises the category of fake news, but we also know that this the idea of fake news can be weaponized and thrown and used against journalism. There's a lot of talk about misleading information. There's confusion about what is misleading, what is disinformation, what is a hoax, what happens in social media, and so forth. But there are some really more worrying kinds of criticisms. I don't know if you've seen this. This is in Chemnitz a few weeks ago. These are well, some very fine people, well, the cousins from Germany, shouting Lügenpresse, which is lying press, and is incidentally the same kind of terminology used by Hitler in Germany, talking about the press. But this is not the only side the criticisms come from. For those of you from Greece, you will recognize this. This is about journalists. This was during the peak of the financial crisis in Greece. So there is a lot of there's a long genealogy of left critiques of journalism and the media. The famous study by Herman and Chomsky, even going back further to Adorno's The Dialectic of the Enlightenment and the Culture Industries. So the question here is, are these critiques justified, and how can we tell? For the benefit of those of you from Greece, you will remember this incident here when the mainstream media in Greece thought they were representing the majority, only turns out the majority was totally on the other side. But that's not only limited to Greece. Even the famous liberal media of the United Kingdom, for example, the BBC, have been accused of bias. And you can see here the doctored image of Jeremy Corbyn made as if he's wearing this kind of Russian hat and the background being the Kremlin. And a very recent study, it was actually only published yesterday, showing by the Media Reform Coalition in the UK, showing media bias in the case of the anti-Semitism controversy in the UK. And then, I don't know if you can see here, but this is the total coverage amount of news, and the orange light, the orange-colored line is misleading information, and the blue line is inaccurate information. And we're talking about the BBC, we're talking about The Guardian, we're not talking necessarily about the Daily Mail, although that's somewhere here as well. But it's not only in Greece, it's not only in the UK, also in America, and this is the video that doesn't play here, so I have to shift here. And I'm sure some of you must have come across this. It's extremely funny.
Our greatest responsibility is to serve our Treasure Valley communities,
the El Paso, Las Cruces communities,
Eastern Iowa communities,
Mid-Michigan communities.
We are extremely proud of the quality, balanced journalism that CBS 4 News produces.
But
We are concerned about one-sided news stories plaguing our country.
The sharing of biased and false news has become all too common on social media. More alarming, some media outlets publish these same fake stories without checking facts first.
The sharing of biased and false news has become all too common on social media.
More alarming, some media outlets publish these stories simply aren't true without checking facts first.
Unfortunately, some members of the media use their platforms to push their own personal bias and...
Okay, so you get the picture now. All of these channels were reading out from the same script. Incidentally, they all belong to the same person, and they were all talking about how they are not fake news and they represent journalism at its best. So that's how ironic it is and how ridiculous these claims appear to us. Sorry. Okay, so what have been the responses to this crisis? In our work with Lambrini, we came across a very dominant kind of like approach when it comes to journalism. So you ask them, how do you get out of this crisis? And the majority of the response was basically, let's go back to basics, let's go back to what journalism is about, let's go back to what journalists do best, verification, accuracy, objectivity, impartiality, and so forth. So I kind of like group all these under the idea, the discourse of professionalism. So the main response of journalism has been to reintroduce the idea of professionalism. And this, of course, has been done also with a view to sideline all these other players that have entered the field more recently, the bloggers, the social media accounts, and so forth. There is not only the return to the basics kind of discourse, but also enhanced professionalism through techno-solutionism. So here you find like ideas such as the post-industrial journalism by the Tow Center, Emily Bell and her collaborators. You have like ideas about new approaches to verification. In fact, I'm involved in a project that will be using blockchain to verify information. And all this is very good, but I think that, and that's what the critical position that I want to take today, is the question of whether this kind of like return to professionalism is enough. So the assumption behind all these kinds of discourses is that if only journalism were practiced as a profession, the information disorder wouldn't exist, and everybody would live happily ever after. But what does it mean that journalism is a profession? Let's go, and that's what I'm proposing to do today, to go to the kind of like sociology of professions to understand exactly how professions are emerge in society, and also within these professions, what is the role of ethics and ethical systems. So going back to the history of journalism, and I'm sure some of you will be familiar with these, the main emergence, although there were like news trades and news circulation before modernity, in fact journalism appeared with modernity, and some in fact credit the rise of modernity, the advent of modernity, to print media and journalism. In Habermas's quasi-history, he locates the emergence of journalism in the literary salons and in the bourgeois kind of like emerging public sphere. But Karen and Seaton trace this history through the radical press and the unstamped newspapers of the early 19th century. So there is a parallel genealogy here, one that is emerging from, let's say, the literary salons, so the bourgeois publics, and another one that is emerging from the bottom up, from social movements, and in fact from the labor movement, and in the UK, the Chartist movement. So there is a tension between these two genealogies. Incidentally, the North Star here was the most popular newspaper of its time, selling over 50,000 copies per week. And that was the second largest circulation in the whole of the UK. So we're talking about really very popular press in the UK. So eventually this kind of like, these two positions clashed and one of them won. And the one that won was the bourgeois version of liberal journalism as more or less we know it today. So from the Poor Man's Guardian, which was one of the other popular titles there, and you can tell even from the title that it has had a very different approach to the news than the Times. So the Poor Man's Guardian explicitly said that we're pursuing what is morally right and just, whereas the Times were merely chronicling the news as a series of disconnected events. So these were the two kind of like separate genealogies that fed into journalism as a profession. And the tensions between them were resolved through the emergence of a particular function of journalism, which is the watchdog function. So the watchdog function emerged as a compromise between these two positions. So rather than a neutral process of evolution, professionalism and professionalization signal the victory of a particular viewpoint of what journalism should be about and which path it should follow. And I'm not saying, of course, that this is the only approach, but it's certainly the dominant and hegemonic approach to the field. So journalism exited the world of movements and political passions and reinvented itself as a profession, i.e. as delivering disinterested service to clients or the public. So that is what professionalization and professions are about, but we also know through the work of Andrew Abbott that professions are primarily about establishing jurisdiction and knowledge monopolies in a particular field and less about the provision of disinterested services. Within professions, professional ethics codes are the most, this is a quote from Abbott, the most concrete cultural form in which they acknowledge their societal obligations. So in other words, through ethics, professions mediate their relationships with society, but also with the internal field itself. So they mediate between the profession and outside world, but also they regulate and police and control the insides of the profession. The second quote I have here, I just included it because I found it very striking that this was written in the 1960s. So professional ethics are used to confer dignity, honor, and safety to members of the profession, defending them from the dominant class of corporate capitalism. And that was back in 1963. And we all saw how, how well this panned out. So from the point of view of sociology of professions, ethical compliance regulates relationships, but also importantly confers status to members of the profession, both inside and outside of the profession. So professions are, generally speaking, shaped through their ability to address specific social problems through the knowledge and skills they have developed. These skills have to be regulated in specific ways in order both to guarantee the status of profession in society and also to effectively control the members of the profession. So that's why we have ethics codes. So ethics is not necessarily related to philosophical positions, but it's also very important in sociological terms, and the main kind of like sociological function they play is that they regulate the profession inside and they confer status to it. So therefore, it's not enough to say that these ethical codes are related to specific philosophical positions, but you have to also, sociologically speaking, see the extent or examine the extent to which they address the social problems they were developed to solve in the first place. But importantly, they also have to preserve and confer status to members of the profession. However, when it comes to journalism, journalism is not a profession in the same way that medicine is a profession or law is a profession, because it doesn't have monopoly or control over a specific body of knowledge. So from this point of view, it's an anomaly sociologically. So because access to this knowledge is not regulated by the profession itself, that meant that for journalism to attain status in the first place, it had to find another way of doing it, and one of the ways it found was to attach itself to social groups that already had status and that were already powerful in society. So just to expand a little bit on this, the idea is that, you know, doctors or, I don't know, physicists or mathematicians have prestige and status because they control the body of knowledge that belongs to their field. So not everyone knows mathematics, not everyone knows medicine, so the people who are members of the profession know it and control the confines of the profession. But with journalists, anyone can be a journalist. There is no body, even, and I'm saying this as a person who teaches journalism in university, but really what we do is we teach sociology, we teach social science, and we teach some skills. There is no particular body that is specific to journalism, and everyone, theoretically speaking, can become a journalist. So from this point of view, journalism could not acquire status through generating and controlling its own knowledge. So in order to, okay, this is a functionalist explanation, but let's accept for the time being that it might be valid. So instead of controlling a body of knowledge to become powerful, journalism moved through attaching itself to groups that were already powerful, and this is how we have the emergence of this kind of like fourth estate kind of discourse, where it places itself alongside established powers in society. So in the UK, it would be the nobility and the commoners, the Parliament and the House of Lords, as well as the clergy, whereas in other European countries, it would be next to the judiciary or the executive and so forth. Okay, so I preempted my slide here. So the fourth estate rhetoric then alludes to the role of journalism in checking and controlling the powers of government on behalf of individuals that constitute society. And I'm saying here individuals because really it's liberal ideology that underpins this kind of approach to journalism as a profession and to journalistic ethics. So the role then that the fourth estate plays in society is that of legitimizing the other three powers. So that's its role, to legitimize, and that's why, as a watchdog, it is tasked with holding the powers accountable so that they can be legitimate. And I have here a very long quote by Habermas, but the bottom part is a thing like really important, basically journalists are a mandatory of the public, they represent the public, and they have to be independent from political and social pressure like the judiciary. And then finally, they have to be impartial and to articulate demands for legitimation. So that's the function of journalism as a fourth estate. So this kind of like normative theory that we see in Habermas and in others reveals the liberal underpinnings of journalism ethics. So there's a very famous book that we teach in journalism schools occasionally critically, which is The Four Theories of the Press, that of course emerged in the 1950s, and it revealed a lot about the 1950s, perhaps more so than journalism. But I think, interestingly enough, that's how they broke down the various approaches to journalism from a normative point of view. So they said, okay, you have like authoritarian theory of the press and the Soviet theory of the press, and these are just two versions of propaganda. And then you have the liberal approach that is like publish and perish, publish everything, and then, you know, people will make up their minds. And then the social responsibility rhetoric, which is basically a modification that says, okay, publish, but do it responsibly through self-regulation. So these are versions of the same thing. Siebert and his colleagues were obviously in favor of some kind of like self-regulation, but even this self-regulation takes place within primarily a liberal ideological framework. But when it comes to self-regulation and ethics, an important characteristic, an important aspect that we know from professional ethics codes is that they're individual rather than corporate. So if there is an ethical issue that has to be adjudicated, this takes place at the level of the individual. So it's one rotten apple that has to be addressed and expelled maybe from the profession, and then everything returns to normal. So they don't regulate for group failure, but they regulate for individual instances. So I think this is very clear, because we can see how attempts to introduce any kind of collective reform are very, very passionately resisted. And I'm using here the example again of the UK, the Leveson inquiry that was shelved. So they had like this big inquiry, spent a lot of money, outlined everything that is wrong with the press, and then did nothing about it. Because there is it's impossible within a liberal framework to regulate the profession as a whole. You can only do it on an individual basis. So you can say to the News of the World, you have to stop trading. You can say to specific journalists, you're going to go to prison for what you did, but you cannot regulate the profession as a whole. So, just to sum up the argument so far, I have argued that the main response to the crisis on behalf of journalism is to a retreat to professionalism, even if sometimes this is professionalism with, with steroids in the sense of technological acceleration. Professionalism is a means by which jurisdiction is established over certain social problems in specific ways, and some of these specific ways involve the development of ethics codes that regulate relationships with society. And also the professions use ethics codes to attain, preserve, or enhance status. Journalism as a profession functions to legitimize the political system as the fourth estate, and liberalism is the ideology behind normative theories that underpin ethical codes of journalism, especially these ideas of objectivity and impartiality. So now, the question is, can all these adequately address the challenges of the information disorder? So, as I promised, I'm going to very briefly expand on the main components of the information disorder, but I'm not going to go into a lot of detail because I'm pretty sure that by now most of you will be familiar with these kinds of discussions. So the information disorder includes misinformation, which is misleading information, disinformation, which is on purpose false information, and malinformation, which includes weaponized speech and hate speech. Can professionalism address this? We can see the responses to this in terms of two main responses, and the first is a practical one, and the second is a political one. So the practical one is that journalism should develop new skills, regulate them with new ethics within a context that regulates other components as well. This is primarily the approach that the Council of Europe, for example, has taken. And it's aided in this through partners such as Pointer, First Draft, but also journalism schools and regulatory bodies. But there is also a political answer to this, which I'm going to try and develop here in a kind of like a side way. So is this practical approach enough? There's this new book coming out very shortly by Benkler and his collaborators on network propaganda. So this is a big data study that they have tried to see what is the role of this kind of like information disorder in the context of the United States. And one of the things that they found is that liberals and conservatives in the United States differ substantially because liberals want facts, whereas conservatives want confirmation of their views. So Benkler and his collaborators end up blaming the right-wing ecosystem, arguing that it is the primary culprit in sowing confusion and distrust in the American ecosystem. And the reason for this is because none of these right-wing bloggers or media follow the norms or processes of professional journalistic objectivity. But the question is, as they said themselves, even if they did, audiences respond in a different way, and they do so because they are not the kind of like individual units that process information rationally. They belong to different social milieux, different social communities, and these kinds of like social communities filter the way in which they approach the news. And we know this since the 1950s, really, and the study of Lazarsfeld and his collaborators. So the idea that, somehow we can fix the news through techniques that verify facts, and that this will fix the whole kind of like approach to the news is, I think, not necessarily valid. In fact, I don't know if you know this, but when Donald Trump was on the campaign trail, he was fact-checked to death. He was fact-checked by every single liberal or any other medium, really, both in the context of the US and abroad. And what did that accomplish? Not much. So I want to argue then that fact-checking, literacy, new skills are not enough. I'm not saying that we should discount them, obviously not, but they're not enough if they are still in the service of liberal journalism and its role in legitimizing the current political system through accountability. And that brings us to the question of what is the political media system today. And here's a quote from the New York Times, quoting Mr. Bannon. You know Mr. Bannon, formerly of Breitbart News and formerly special advisor to President Trump. So that's what he says about the media. The media should be embarrassed and humiliated and keep its mouth shut and just listen for a while. And then he says, I want you to quote this. The media here is the opposition party. They don't understand this country. They still do not understand why Donald Trump is the president of the United States. And really, honestly, much as I disagree with Steve Bannon, he's absolutely right here. Because the media are the opposition party, because this is their task. They have to operate as watchdogs, and they don't understand society, and they don't understand why Donald Trump was elected. However, the media, being the media, instead of asking society and listening to society, they decided to listen to Mr. Bannon himself. So here's the New Yorker Festival inviting Mr. Bannon to tell us what society thinks. So again, like, they operate in a different way, not looking at society, but looking elsewhere. There's another aspect of this that I want to call into attention, and again with Lambrini, we've examined this political context as a context of post-democracy. And we use here the approach of Colin Crouch, who said that through neoliberalism, we're moving slowly to a post-democratic state of affairs where the democratic apparatus is there, but decisions are taken elsewhere, and primarily in secret offices of multinational corporations and banks. So parliaments, judiciaries, and executives are really empty forms. And we see also that journalism is more and more becoming an empty form itself. So within post-democracy then, what is the role of journalism? If it acts as a force that legitimizes the political system, then we see that this is contradictory and it cannot really function. So if post-democracy is seen as a spectacle, then it's validated by mainstream media, which are themselves operating as firms or brands. This is, in fact, the terminology that we have used in the Reuters report. We're talking about news brands. So we've also moved into a different kind of understanding of profession. So can anything here change or improve because of journalistic professionalism, especially when its role is one of conferring legitimacy? So this is then why we have to introduce a political answer to the question of the information disorder and not only a technological one. So I think the political answer should begin by recognition that the information disorder is a symptom, not the illness itself. And secondly, that journalism should re-examine and reflect on its own role vis-a-vis the political sphere and the public's. Very often we accept this fourth estate rhetoric as a given, and there's very little analysis of where it came from and what function it served. It may well be that the fourth estate really accomplished a wonderful compromise, social compromise in the 19th century, but here we found ourselves in totally different historical circumstances that perhaps call for a different approach to journalism in normative terms and this kind of like new approach to the normative role of journalism will also introduce a new understanding and ethics for journalism. Some of these, using specific examples, some of these again with Lambruni, we kind of like identified elements of a new normative approach in some forms of journalism that exist currently that involve a resocialization of journalism, that understand journalism as embedded in society rather than a detached representative or a mandatory of a public. A reorientation towards voicing social needs and possibly addressing these social needs where they can, an explicit realignment with principles of equality and social justice, and I think this is lost in a lot of journalism of today. When you invite people like Bannon, giving them a platform to argue whatever they want to argue, then you are in violation of these principles of equality and justice. So journalism is no longer, or should not, especially in the current historical conjuncture, should not perhaps be seen as being in the service of legitimizing the political system, but instead in the service of social transformation. Sorry about all this text on this slide. I got carried away by my own argument. So from the liberal requirement to publish everything responsibly in the marketplace of ideas, to move towards a position where journalism actively contributes to an emancipatory promise of modernity. And I'm on purpose quoting Habermas here because I don't know why he thought or he thinks that through procedures we can attain this kind of like emancipation. But perhaps we need some more social action in order for this to occur. But this time, this is not the emancipation of the white males of the 18th century, but rather emancipation for all. So the ethics of journalism has to be reorganized with this normative requirement in mind, and not this idea that people are cut-off individuals. I also want to insist that journalism is not a practice abstracted by either the circumstances of its own production or the historical world where it operates. So we cannot decide on its norms and ethics in a philosophical manner, but we have to do it in a historically embedded and materially embedded manner. So we have to situate journalism in the world, which means that it has to be more attuned to the here and now and the evolving needs of society, and not merely to record and report on the conditions of life, but calling for action to overcome certain conditions and realize new conditions. So, in short, not to retreat into some kind of like idealized professionalism, but to re-immerse itself in the current needs of society. And then its practices have to be reoriented towards these kinds of like current needs of society. I think that in a series of interviews we did with Lambruni a few years ago among Greek journalists, there was a thing that someone told us that was very striking. So we asked him, what is journalism for? What do you think journalism ideally should be like? And the answer was, I think that journalism should fill the pulse of society. I think that journalism today has failed in this. They don't fill the pulse of society. And honestly, I don't think any kind of like new verification processes are going to help them in this. It's the whole kind of like normative approach to what journalism should be about that has to change. And it has to be reoriented much more towards the needs of society rather than the political system itself. So from this point of view, and this is my concluding sentence, I think that we need to reimagine journalism as a collective resource for reimagining and reframing and redefining the social problems of today. That's all for me. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Eugenia, for going to the root of the problem. I just wanted to remark a small phrase that you said. So journalism as a profession is a sociological anomaly. I like this one. And also that information disorder is a symptom and not exactly the cause of the problems of the public sphere. So probably have some questions, some remarks.
Thank you. The antidote to the symptom that you proposed from first reading does not seem to me to be that different from the civic journalism movement of the 1980s in the US. And of course, after that came all kinds of deregulation, and we are who we are today. Would you see any differences between civic journalism as described in the 80s and 90s to what you're proposing here?
Yes, definitely. Civic journalism and this whole movement of public journalism, this is very close to reimagining journalism, but perhaps what we need is some, first of all, for this to scale, and secondly, for this to specifically address this outside necessarily a representative democracy kind of framework. At least that's what I would push. So I think public journalism and civic journalism still operate with this idea of liberal representative democracy as the kind of ideal polity. But perhaps this is no longer viable in a globalized and hyper-capitalist world. So I think it's very difficult to practice civic or public journalism in a context that is socially globalized. And I think we see this very clearly, not necessarily in the US, but in smaller countries like Greece, like Ireland, maybe Cyprus as well. So you see that whatever journalism does, it cannot address the global problems because it operates very locally. So this is why I think that these kinds of approaches, on the one hand, need to scale, but also if you are to scale, you have to remove yourself from the immediate civic environment and try to think globally of how to change the whole of it. I don't know if this is satisfactory.
No, I mean, I just asked for your opinion and you gave it to me. I don't necessarily agree, but it's a discussion that keeps going, so thank you.
Sure.
Yeah.
That was wonderful, thank you. Can I get you back to the Benkler study, where there is this assertion that the liberals want more facts while the conservatives want a confirmation of their views. So can you talk a little bit about what you think about this study, the Benkler study? Because I didn't understand what your position was. So you agree with this, or, I mean, what's the idea? Sorry.
Yeah, okay, that's well, to begin with, I cheated because I really look forward to this book, but it hasn't been published yet. So I relied a lot on extensive reviews, and specifically on a review that was published in the New Yorker magazine, where they had like extended extracts from this study. To begin with, I think that it's not necessarily, I think that you will find always differences between how audiences react, and I know this from audience studies. Whether this can be mapped onto specific political positions or social classes or other demographics is still something, okay, it depends on how you divide the pie. If you look for political differences, you're going to find political differences. If you want to look for social differences, you will find social differences. The kind of like, for me, the study that is unsurpassed in this respect is the Katz and Lazarsfeld study of the 1950s, where they say that you filter the news through significant opinion leaders within your own social environment. So obviously in different places in the US or Greece or elsewhere, that's how you filter the news. And some of it will be through a political filter, and some of it will be through other kinds of like social filters. So I wouldn't necessarily agree with this finding. And I think that a lot of the right-wing fact-checking blogs are also evidence that this is not necessarily the case. But what is important, and why I use this in this particular slide, is to show that already audiences react differently, so they don't all react as rational information processors, which is this idea behind this kind of like techno-solutionism approach to journalism. Okay.
Okay, let me see if I can say this. So, if you have a liberal democracy, let's say, crisis, a post-democratic landscape, then it stands to reason that what is conceived as a component of this whole landscape, namely journalism as the fourth estate, is also in crisis. But how can you propose that recreating somehow the function of journalism in the public sphere can address the crisis of liberal democracy or of the totality of these, let's say, political functions and institutions? Because it seems to me that journalism is very much one aspect of things that evolve together. So you can't really think of journalism in the sense that we understand it today outside of a liberal framework. So my first question is, do we now use journalism in order to recreate some sort of concept for how we are governed, or how we describe society as a whole in political and perhaps sociological terms? Can this be a function for journalism? And my second question is, when you mentioned Steve Bannon and platforming Steve Bannon, and of course this is a discussion that is very widespread. There are, of course, a ton of people that voted for Trump or voted for Brexit that conceive of Steve Bannon's idea as somehow representing their idea of social justice, of their idea of not being represented in the institutions of the state, and therefore very much also a reaction against what could be a post-democratic, what could be described as a post-democratic landscape. So how do you avoid a kind of concept of an agonistic space where you just have people all professing to go back down into society, but some of them are basically doing what Steve Bannon is doing at the grassroots level? So you've got all these media that, I suppose the danger is in your proposal that they'd be as legitimate as media that express, say, the opposite idea. So that's, those are my questions.
Okay, to begin with, that's why I think I showed these examples of the early radical journalism in the context of the UK. This was not a journalism that was like cut off from society, in the sense that it was directly linked to social movements, and specifically the Chartist movement or the labor movement of its time. And you see today the reason why some of these right-wing media are successful is because they operate with a particular kind of like grassroots movement, even if this is like, you know, the identitarian movement or like other kinds of like politically, according to me, or in my own view, problematic positions. So that's what I'm saying. It's like, stop pretending that journalism can operate cut off from society. So when you couch journalism as a profession, you separate it, and it itself tried to separate itself from society, but I'm saying that this is no longer possible. So this addresses the first kind of like the first part of your question, that already journalism was part of movements in the early radical form. Then it was part of the bourgeois, like represented the middle classes, the ruling classes in its current formation, and of course now there is that it receives a lot of pressures from all quarters. And then in terms of your question of how do we adjudicate between competing social movements, well, I mean, that's the question of politics, really, isn't it? I mean, you can only fight it out, not in violent terms, but certainly you have to kind of like support your ideas and go with that. I mean, there is no other solution. I would support a journalism that comes from the social movement that actually represents justice and equality. And I think it's very easy to prove that neither Steve Bannon nor this kind of like identitarian movement in Europe represents equality and justice. It's very easy to prove this. So that's my kind of like answer.
So, if we are to fight it out in some sort of new public sphere, how is this different from a marketplace of ideas? How is this different to the basic sort of liberal premise that we should publish everything and may the best idea win?
No, it's not may the best idea win, may the true idea win. It's a different epistemology.
I found interesting what you said about it's more than just fact-checking, and that it also depends, filtering is also the audience and the reaction. So in a time where with social media, the audience is allowed to react and to say its opinion, how does that massage the message or news in general as a filter? And the second thing is I wanted you to, when you talk about reimagining journalism, if we were to take that out of the political context and just as its function to serve society, what do you, and quickly, what would be 3 big things or 3 things that would, for you, be an ideal idea of journalism? I know it's a big question.
Starting with the latter, I think that there's a famous journalist, a famous person that was also a journalist said the point is not to interpret the world, the point is to change it. So I would go with that, you know. What the world needs today is social transformation. So and then that's why I also included this idea that I find very interesting, to use journalism as a collective resource for defining the problems that we face today. And I think a lot of grassroots journalism is doing this, and I think it's very well that they do this. But of course, again, it's the question of scaling and of becoming larger. And perhaps in terms of the media ecology of social media, on the one hand, this allows you to do it. On the other hand, the social media themselves operate within a very liberal framework that cuts off individuals from their social group and reorganizes them in terms of other kinds of parameters. So maybe there is something in the structure of social media that precludes this. But on the other hand, they do allow you to scale quite quickly. So I don't know, in terms of the filtering of audiences, I don't know. Yes, there are filters, but at the same time, the main filter is your immediate environment, and also the extent to which what you read in the news or what you read in social media corresponds to your lived experience. So there are a lot of things that we recognize. I don't know if you watch this kind of the Brett Kavanaugh and Ford's testimony, and a lot of what she said resonated immediately with my own experiences, with experiences of women I know. So you know that it's true because you have experienced it and you believe it. So it's this kind of correspondence with experience that ultimately we have to validate at some point. Okay, yeah, exactly. That added to her credibility for sure. For sure, yeah. I don't know if addressed partly. Yeah, absolutely, yeah.
I have a small remark and a question. The first one is, I'm happy to see that Yochai Benkler is changing his point of view on the internet in general, because he was one of the most prominent utopian writers about the internet. Yeah. The question or the remark that I have is that I'm really happy about what you presented, and I think the same thing, that we should concentrate more on a politically engaged, grassroots, embedded in society journalism. But the problem is that what I can observe about the dominant tendencies is the contrary. What I mean is that the whole disinformation problem has put platforms and mainstream media in the same, let's say, alliance. The idea being of we need to label the good news and separate it from from the bad news, which would be engaged or whatever. So what we see actually is the contrary movement. For instance, we can see that main platforms such as Facebook or Snapchat or Google are starting to cleaning up their index from what they think is engaged and not factual journalism, and putting on the front page the real, a very small number of mainstream media with which they, have business deals and stuff like that. So, and of course, these platforms are a necessary evil because that's how people get to news. So how do we do to address this kind of nexus, let's say?
Okay, the short answer is I don't know. Okay. The long answer is that for sure, but as you mentioned, the way in which the architecture of social media, along with obviously their business models, are such that they can't afford basically to exclude a huge portion of people who would be producing data for them. And we see that there are some instances of these kinds of like Jacobin, for example, is pretty huge in terms of social media, although I don't know to what extent this translates into actual income. But then, of course, you begin encountering the same questions, I guess, that radical journalism has faced ever since, which is what kind of political economy should be used for? Can we have Jacobin operates on the same model as the Harvard Business School. Bhaskar Shankara has said that this is their business model. They bought the Tribune newspaper, which was a radical title in the UK, and the first thing they did was to sack everyone who worked for them. So, okay, so then we have to kind of move into these kinds of contradictions. But on the other hand, I think that there is there is no easy solution. We have to keep on.
Well. Thank you so much, Eugenia. I think we are looking for the answers. We don't have the short answers, but we are looking for the longer answers, and that's why we are here, academics and professionals. And it was really very enlightening what you talked about, a passionate, elegant, but firm speech about journalism and its problems today. And on behalf of the University of Open University of Cyprus, I would like to thank you. Where is Charmine? I forgot to do that yesterday. Charmine? Yeah, okay, she'll come back. Eugenia, thank you so much. This is for you.
Oh, thank you so much.
This is a symbol of prosperity and good luck, and we hope that you continue your beautiful work. Πρέπει εκεί να κοιτάμε.